So, success, eh? It's something everybody wants, and yet it's something society says that not everybody can have. When you think of the word success, who do you think of? Is it Gates, Bezos, Musk? Why do you think of them? Is it because they have a big house, lots of cars, or lots of money? Why do we think of success like this? So, basically, I read Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. If you haven't read the thing, it really just talks about lots of people from lots of places with lots of stories on how they became successful in their own way. Of course, there's lots more in that book, but that's all you really need to know for this video. I thought it was fine by all counts, which is actually pretty high praise from someone like me who normally wouldn't touch a book like that with a 40-foot pole. But still, it did open up a lot of parts of my mind to things that I wouldn't normally have considered. Like, for example, what is success? Success is a complex thing with a lot of nuances and things that you wouldn't really consider when you just think of the word success. Throughout the book, the author talked a lot about success. I mean, that was kind of the subtitle of the book. But when you think about it, when were you ever really cleared on what success actually entails? That's kind of what this video is about. So let's look into that. I took a survey of about 502 people, asking them some almost invasive questions like, where are you from? What is your gender? Who do you consider successful and why? The answers were very interesting, so I'm going to be breaking them down a little bit for you. I asked about 10 questions in the survey, but I'm only going to go through about 2 or 3 here. So if you're interested in seeing more of the results, I'll be linking the data in the description box below so you can kind of peruse it at your own pace. A huge thanks to Miss Harvard on Instagram and the scholars for answering my survey, plus a few people from the AS community. So one of the first questions I asked people was what country they're from. This isn't necessarily as interesting as some of the other questions that I asked, but it is the most relevant to the other answers we're going to get. The predominant number of question answerers were from the United States by a landslide, followed by Canada at 6.9%, England at 4.6%, and then a handful of people from Scotland, the Netherlands, and the UK at 0.9% each. Also surveyed were people from Britain, Slovakia, and Egypt, among lots of others, but do note that most of these answers are coming from a Western perspective. I actually think this is a really interesting perspective, because the US is one of the richest countries in the world, and arguably the most influential, and as a Canadian, it might be nice for me to kind of gain insight onto what's going on for our neighbors in the South. Another question I asked was whether or not the participants considered themselves successful. I didn't leave any room for on-the-fence answers like maybe or I don't know. It was just a simple click one yes or no type of answer. What actually surprised me were the amount of people that said yes. A look at this graph quickly tells you that the results were almost split in half. Yes clocked in at about 47.8% of results, and no clocked in at about 52.2%. My expectation was, with the sort of nihilistic glass half empty view that the world seems to have nowadays, that no would win by the landslide. As it turns out, the people who answered no were in the majority, but by a lesser margin than I actually expected initially. That sort of gives me hope for my generation. The next question I'm going to focus on is who we consider successful. I left an open box for this question, so anyone could put whoever they wanted and why if they felt like it. I will preface this by saying that so many people said BTS. Good on you, K-pop stans, always coming through for your boys. If you look at the results, I was surprised again by just how many people said a friend or a family member was the most successful person they could think of. Again, I expected the results to lean in a different way, maybe pulling up more Bezos' or Musk's or Gates, like I mentioned earlier. But surprisingly, those numbers paled in comparison to the amount of people that wanted to highlight their mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles or family friends as successful people. Which makes sense to me. These are people that worked hard, maybe coming up from the bottom and clawing their way to the top, or at least the middle. And maybe they weren't recognized as much as these people thought were appropriate. Some other answers I received a lot were celebrities like the Kardashians, Nicki Minaj, BTS like I mentioned, and a couple Taylor Swift. On the more general side, we also had people like doctors, CEOs, lawyers, and bankers. We also got people that achieve happiness, stable jobs, or people with lots of money, which was predictable. The last question is the one I think was actually the most interesting in the way its results came in. Given the choice between these 6 jobs, which one do you think would bring you to success the easiest? Participants were able to choose between entrepreneurs, freelance writers, waiters, cashiers, small business owners, or social media influencers. The results were split in a way that I find strange. Cashier and waiter took the last places, with less than 2% of participants choosing those jobs. That doesn't necessarily surprise me. Freelance writer came in at 12.5%, and small business owner came in at 34.1%. I actually expected small business owner to come in a little bit lower than freelance writer, but the thing that took the top spot was entrepreneur. I find that to be interesting, given just a quick look at Oxford Dictionary defines entrepreneur as someone who operates a business or businesses taking on greater than normal financial risks in order to do so. Becoming a successful entrepreneur is a tricky thing. There are very few entrepreneurs that are actually able to achieve the success that they're aiming for. Actually, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US, only about 25% of new businesses will last 15 years or longer. That's not a lot. So why do we continue to shoot for this huge goal, even though we know it's probably not possible? The answer here, I think, lies with our parents and their parents. Our ancestors came from a harder life, especially those who were immigrants. My family has stayed in the same country for the last couple generations, and we haven't really had to move around that much. And that's good for us. I mean, we haven't necessarily been living lavish lifestyles, but we're still doing okay, and that's kind of what counts. We haven't been forced out of our homes or anything. Lots of people have been forced out of their homes, though, and I think that might be why the big goal is to not have to worry about that. When your grandparents or great-grandparents or whatever were packing up and moving their entire lives across the world, they probably weren't doing it for the fun of it. They were probably doing it to make sure that themselves, and probably you, had a better life in the future. Moving comes with a lot of stresses. There are new opportunities, new people, new challenges, and new jobs, sure, but those are difficult things to adapt to. Moving countries is hard, but the benefits are often worth it. In their eyes, the traditional view of success, the one with the big house, the cars, the immense amount of jewelry, that was the best way to live things because you'd never want for anything again. This was kind of inspired by the West's general consensus that excess is best. If you don't have enough, you're screwed, but if you have too much, you can get rid of it, keep it for yourself, or even better, sell it. This has been the way of life in a Western capitalist society for a very long time. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this isn't something to shoot for. If the vision of life that looks best to you is the one where you have the big house, the big family, the cars, the jewelry, whatever, that's great for you. You should aim for that. Just because it's not for everyone doesn't mean it's not for you. But personally, I find that this way of life is becoming more and more outdated as the years go on. The world is a vastly different place from what it was when our ancestors were around. Well, back then you kind of had to scrounge up whatever you could and fight for whatever was left. Sometimes it was even hard to get enough money to get the bare necessities. Now there's just generally more stuff available than there was. Take the pineapple, for example. Back in the day, fruits like the pineapple weren't really available in most parts of the world where you couldn't grow them. Rich families in Europe would buy them and, instead of eating them, display them on their tables as status symbols, to prove that they were rich to the other people. Nowadays, you can walk into any store and buy a pineapple for cheap. You don't even display it on your table anymore, you just eat it. Thanks to improvements in technology, the economy, and mobility, these things are easy to get, and there's hardly any people that haven't heard of a pineapple anymore. This leads to that way of life sort of being outdated. You don't need to scrounge for what you want anymore, and you don't have to fight for the basic necessities. You can just buy them from the store for a lot cheaper than you could have. Excess is no longer a necessary thing to aim for. You can just sort of aim for the basics. Minimalism. With the rise of technology and spaces for younger people around the internet, the way we see our world has changed quite a bit. Many sites, predominantly Tumblr and sometimes Instagram or TikTok, are mostly inhabited by kids, teenagers, and young adults, which can both be a good thing and literally the worst thing ever. But let's focus on the good for now. These places are now sort of breeding grounds for those who have started and will continue the trend of romanticizing everyday life. As a frequent visitor of Tumblr and Instagram, I've seen my share of posts that ask, what if we danced in the kitchen late at night and everything was perfect? Or, what if we raised chickens on a farm together and everything was perfect? And with all that comes the birth of cottagecore. Cottagecore, in case you haven't heard of it, and if you have, I swear this is relevant, is the aesthetic of living a small traditional life with just the necessities. For example, living in a cottage on the countryside, hence the cottage bit. This rise of cottagecore has come mostly in the form of teens who aren't old enough to move out yet, sharing images of their dream lives on the internet in little photo sets and GIFs. Sure, these kids might grow out of it, but it's still kind of comforting and interesting to me that instead of the big cars and the house and the what have you, these kids are choosing to put comfort into smaller things, like a chicken farm on the countryside. This is what's appealing to these people and the new generation that's growing up to take over the world. This leads me to wonder, could it be that our parents' and grandparents' view of success is going to die out soon? As Generation Z and Millennials grow up to be the dominant generation on Earth, will living a more humble life become the universally agreed upon definition of success? With the answers of my survey, and the average age of my participants being around that age range, I feel like that's a possibility. And it kind of makes me happy. Success is kind of a weird thing. Everyone wants it in some way or another, whether they think they do or not. Everyone wants a taste of some kind of success. Whether success means we prioritize material things, family, a place, a time, a feeling, everyone seems to live for it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's good to have something to strive for. But it's also probably not a good thing for everyone to be aiming for exactly the same thing. Not everyone can be a millionaire because, in the words of Syndrome from The Incredibles, when everyone is special, then no one will be. As generations come and generations go, it seems the world is willing to be a little bit more diverse. The traditional view of what success is changing, and I think that's a good thing. Maybe we'll stop depending on other people's approval of us, and maybe we'll move on to doing what makes us happy instead. Maybe we'll start prioritizing our own comfort instead of aiming for things that are more out of reach. Maybe we'll stop aiming for the things that our parents want us to do that we're not totally sure we want anyway and start living for ourselves. And maybe we'll all be able to have our own definition of success. Okay, that was probably better. Now, let's see if my computer was recording the entire time. It wasn't! Oh my god.